how we can create custom login page for Next-Auth in Next.js version 13. So we are going to create this custom sign-in page for Next-Auth, which uses the intercepting route concept of the Next.js. So as you can see, we are in a modal login page, which is actually an intercepting page route for this sign-in here. So if I hard refresh the page, we are headed to the actual sign-in page of our application. So we are going to use this custom login page instead of this simple and basic sign-in page that is created by the Next-Auth automatically for us. So sit tight here, because in this video you're going to learn a lot about how to create a Next-Auth custom login page and also how to intercept the routes inside the Next.js application. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, this is a Next.js version 13 project, and I have set up the Next-Auth inside the app directory. So let me show you quickly what's going on here. We have the route handler of the Next-Auth, and as you can see, I have created a handler with the Next-Auth function and set up the credentials provider here. And here we have the authorize function, which is most important part of the credentials provider. And in this function, we should actually authenticate our user. In other words, when the user click on the sign in button inside the sign in page, this authorize function will be called. And the credentials object here contains the provided username and password which user enters in the login page. So actually we should have a mechanism here that checks the provided username and password, and if they are correct, we should return a user object, and if they're not correct, we should return null. The return object of this authorize function will be kept inside the Next-Auth session. So anywhere inside our application, in order to check if the user is authenticated or not, we can check the Next-Auth session, and if there is a user object inside it, we can say that the user is authenticated. And if there is not a user object inside it, we can say that the user is not authenticated. That's it. And as a last step inside the Next-Auth route handler, we export the handler that we've just created as a get function and also as a post function. So every request to the /API/auth/whatever, just like this, will be handled by this route handler. Okay, so if we look back at the authorize function, here you can see we call a login function which takes the username and password. And this login function comes from the lib/auth file. So this is the auth.ts file, and here as you can see, we export the login function which takes the username and password. Then with the help of the Prisma, we check inside our database if such a user with this username is existed, and here we check if the user is not null, which means that there is such a user with that username. And then we use the compare function from the bcrypt library to compare the provided password with the hashed version of the password which is saved inside our database. So if the provided password is correct, we can return this user object from this login function. And before doing that, we just remove the password from the user object and then return it to the authorize function. We are doing that because it is not safe to keep the user password inside the Next-Auth session. And actually we don't need the user password. And let's move on. Next, we have created the providers component, which comes from the Next-Auth/React, and then it gets the children as its prop and wrap the children's inside a session provider. And then we can use this providers component inside the main layout of our application. So now in every client component inside our application, we can access to the use session hook, which actually returns the session of the Next-Auth. And in the server components, we don't need that session provider. We can just call the get server session to retrieve the session of the Next-Auth from the server. That's it. The Next-Auth will handle it for us, and we don't need to worry about it. Okay, and then we have the sign in button, which uses the use session hook, and this use session hook comes from the Next-Auth/React, and it returns the session object, and then we can check if the session is existed and also session has a user inside it. We can just render the name of the user, session.user.name, and also we render a button that calls the sign out function from the Next-Auth. It will sign out the user from our application. And if this condition is is not the case, it means that the user is not authenticated yet. So we have to render a button which calls the sign-in function from the Next-Auth. It automatically redirects the user to the sign-in page. And now let's run our application to see what's going on in the browser. Okay, we have this simple application. This is a link to the home page, and this is the sign-in button. As you can see, we haven't signed in into our application, so if I click on the sign-in, it will redirect us to the sign-in page that Next-Auth will create for us automatically. We didn't create this sign-in page. It is created by the Next-Auth. So here I put my username and also my password, and if I click on the sign-in button here, the authorized function from the credentials provider will be called. So if I click on the sign-in, you can see now in the sign-in button, we have the name of the user and also a sign out button. Okay, that's cool, but how we can create a custom login page for our Next.js application that uses Next-Auth for authentication? So let's get right into it. Okay, if you're still watching, please consider subscribing to my channel. I have a variety of content about Next.js, TypeScript, and also Nest.js that I'm sure you'll find them useful. Okay, so first we need to go to the Next-Auth route handler, and here after the providers list we should add a pages object. Okay, and then inside it we can define a custom route for our sign-in page. So here I'm going to specify the sign-in and set it to /sign-in. So let's save this and let's go back to our application. Let's sign out, and now if I click on the sign in, it will redirect us to the /sign-in, but since we haven't created a sign-in page yet, it shows us a 401 page, which means that the page is not existed in our application. So now let's quickly create a sign-in page in our application. So I go back to VS Code, and here inside the app directory, I'm going to create a directory called sign-in, and then inside it I'm going to create the page.tsx. Okay, so now let's create a functional component here and let's call it sign-in page. Okay, let's save this and go back to our application. If I click on the sign-in, you can see it will redirect us to the sign-in page that we have just created. So now let's go back to VS Code and create this login page. So as I said in the introduction section of this video, we are going to use route intercepting features of the Next.js version 13. So we actually want to create two sign-in page for our application. The first one is our actual sign-in page, and the second one is the sign-in page that will intercept the sign-in route, and it is a modal version of our sign-in page. So the contents of the both sign-in page are the same. So in order to prevent repeating ourselves, we just want to create a login component here inside the components directory, and then we can use it inside both sign-in page. So here I'm going to create a login component here in the components directory, login.tsx. Okay, so I'm going to create a functional component here, and let's create a props types for this component. So I'm going to say type props, and it's going to have a class name, which is going to be a string. Okay, so now we can have the props here. So we have the props object and set its type to the props type that we have just created here. And let's bind the props.class name to the root div of this login page. Okay, and then inside it we're gonna have another div. Let's put a login form text inside it. Okay, and let's add some table and CSS classes here. Okay, and let's go back to our sign-in page and just render a login component here. Okay, and now let's go back to our browser and you can see the login form here. So let's go back to our login component and let's create a form here. Okay, let's add some table CSS classes. We use the flex here and set the direction of the flex to the column. And now we can have two input for username and password here. So I put two input box here, and let's import the input box. It is a component with just a label and also an input together. You can find it here inside the components directory. And as you can see, the name of the first one is username and the second one is password. Also, we set the type of the second input box to password, so it will mask the password when we are typing the password. And here, as you can see, inside the onChange event of each input box, we have set a username and pass state to the correspond input box value. So let's define our two state here, the username and pass, and set them to user useref hook from React. We use useref here because we don't want our page to re-render every time user inputs a character inside the input box. You can also use React hook form library to handle this form. But in this video, we're not going to use the React hook form library. We just want to keep it simple. Okay, so as you can see, we have two state here, username and password, and we bind them to their correspondent input boxes. Okay, and then we need to create two buttons. The first one is for the sign in, and the second one is actually a link for canceling the signing operation. Okay, so first let me create a div here and then put those two buttons inside it. Okay, and now let's set the class name here. We just use the flex option here, and inside it we can have our two buttons. The first one is the sign in button, which its type is submit. We didn't create the submit function for this form, and we're going to create it in a second. And next to the sign in button, we're going to have a link here, which is actually a cancel button, which will direct the user to the props.callback URL or to the home page if the callback URL is not existed. So we didn't define the callback URL inside the props of this login component. So we're going to quickly create that, and here inside the props, we should add the callback URL, which is going to be a string. Okay, so now let's save this and go back to our application, and here it gives us an error, and that's because we use the useref inside a server component. So let's turn it to a client component here. We can't use a server component for our login component in the Next-Auth. I have tried to use a server component, but it's not possible, and I will tell you the reason in a second. Okay, and let's go back to our browser, and as you can see, we have the username input box and also the password input box, and then we have the sign in button here, and also we have the cancel link here, which if I click here, it will redirect us back to the home page. So again, if I click on the sign in, we will be redirected to the sign in page. Okay, so now let's go back to our login component here, and here we need to create a onSubmit function. So I'm going to say const onSubmit, which is going to be an async function that has one parameter e, which is going to be type of form event. So now we can easily set this onSubmit function to the onSubmit event of our form here. And let's create the body of this onSubmit function. The first thing we should do here is to call the prevent default of the parameter. So it will prevent the page from refreshing. So here I'm going to call prevent default. That's it. And then here we should call the sign in function that comes from the Next-Auth. So I'm going to say await sign in. Here, as you can see, the sign in function comes from the Next-Auth/React, and here we should say that with which provider we are going to authenticate our user. I'm going to go ahead with the credentials, and then we should pass an object here that first of all contains the username, okay, and set it to the username ref.current, and also we should do that with the password, okay, and set it to the pass state.current. So remember, the username and pass are useref, so that's why we use the .current here. And then we can also specify the redirect here. We can set it to true, so after the sign in is completed, it will redirect us to the callback URL that we are going to set here. So we can set the callback URL here and set it to props.callback URL, and if the callback URL is not provided, we can just redirect the user to the home page of our application. That's it. And if we don't want to automatically redirect the user to the callback URL, we can just set the redirect to false. Okay, and now let's go back to our browser, and here, as you can see, we have the username and also my password here, and if I click on the sign in, it does nothing for us, just refreshing the page, and that's because here inside the form we didn't set the onSubmit of the form to the onSubmit function that we have just created. Okay, and just call the onSubmit and just set it to onSubmit function. So now let's save this and go back to our browser, and if I click on the sign in, you can see we will redirect it to the home page, and now we can see inside the sign in button the name of the user, which is Sakura Dev, and it means that the user is now authenticated. Okay, so if I click on the sign out and again click on the sign in and just put a wrong password here, and if I click on the sign in, you can see we will be redirected again to the sign in page, and here we have a query prompter here that has the error equals to credential sign in, which means that the sign in was not successful because we have provided the wrong password. Okay, so now let's go back to our login component, and also we can have the error here inside the props. So we have the error, okay, which is going to be a string, or we can just set it to boolean. We just set it to string, and here before the form we can check that if props.error is existed. So now let's turn it to a boolean value. So these two double exclamation mark turn the error props to a boolean variable. Okay, if the error existed, we can render a message here. We're going to render a paragraph tag here, okay, and then we can say something like authentication failed. Okay, so now let's get back to our sign-in page here, and let's define a props for the sign-in page. I'm going to create a type and name it to props. Okay, we're going to have a search params here, which is actually this search params here. We have the callback URL and also the error here. We can access to this search params from the browser URL. So let's get back to our sign-in page and set the search params to a record here, and let's set the type of the key to a string union. It is going to be a callback URL or an error. So the search params can either be callback URL or error, and then the value of the search param is just a string. So in this way we can access to the search params of the sign-in page. So now let's get the props here in our component and set its type to the props type that we have just created. And now we can set the error props here. We're going to set it to the props.searchparams.error. Okay, we can do this with the callback URL. So we're going to have the callback URL, and we can set it to props.searchparams.callback URL. Okay, so now let's get back to our sign-in page and provide a wrong password. And if I click on the sign-in, it will here render the paragraph tag here that says authentication failed. So let's get back to our login component and put some tailwind CSS classes to style the error tag here. Set the class name to the BG red 100 and also text color to the text red 600, and also set the text alignment to the center. So I'm going to use text center, and then we should have some padding. So I'm going to use the P2 for padding, and let's get back to our browser, and you can see the error message here which says that authentication failed. So actually we have misspelled the authentication, so let's fix that. Okay, and now we have a correct message here. So let's provide the correct password and click on the sign in, and it will redirect us to our home page because we didn't provide a callback URL. So that's it for the custom sign in page. But in the next section of this video, we're going to intercept the sign in route here and load the sign in page inside a modal component. So in order to do that, I go back to our VS Code, and here inside the app directory, side by side our sign in page, I'm going to create another route for intercepting the sign in route here. So since the intercept route for sign in page is in the same level of the sign in route, we can have a parenthesis here, and then inside it we just have one dot, which means that we are going to intercept a route in the same level of this directory. And then we should pass the name of the route that we are going to intercept. So it's sign in, so we're going to use the exact spelling of the sign in route here. And then inside it, we're going to have the page.tsx. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that every time inside our application, we are going to go to the sign-in page through a link component. We will intercept the sign-in page and call this intercept sign-in page instead of this actual sign-in page. That's simple. So here we just render a functional component, and let's set it to sign in page, I don't know, page 2 for example, or intercepted. Okay, and let's go back to our browser, and sign out, and if I click on the sign in, you can see we still go to the actual sign in page. And that's because we are not going to the sign in page through a link component. We actually redirect the user and reload the page. And that's because we don't go to the sign in page through a link component. So let's go back to our sign in button here. Okay, and here instead of having a button which calls the sign in function, which automatically redirect us to the sign in page, that here inside the route handler we have specified it. So the sign in function knows exactly where is the sign in page, and it will redirect us to that sign in page. But here, as you can see, we use a button element for calling the sign in page. Actually, we don't need to call the sign in function. We can just have a link here, a link component from the Next.js, and we don't need the onClick event here, and we can set the href of this link component to just /signin. Okay, so let's get back to our browser, and here as you can see we have a link here. So let's give it some Tailwind CSS classes to look better. We can have the text green, for example 600, and I think that's okay. So now if I click on the sign in, it's a link component and it will redirect us to the sign in page intercepted. As you can see, the sign in page has been intercepted with this sign in page intercepted page. Okay, so now let's go back to our intercepted sign in page. It's here, and just put the login component here, and let's import it from the components directory. Okay, and let's go back to our actual sign in page, and here let's copy the props type and paste it here, and we can have the props and set its type to the props type. Okay, so as you can see, the intercepted login page is exactly the same our actual sign in page. We can't see any differences here, so let's turn it to a modal component. I've already created a modal component inside the components directory. You can use any UI library for this modal component. I have used the Tailwind CSS and headless UI for creating this modal component, but you can use whatever component you want. Also, you can find it inside the GitHub repo of this project. So I'm going to use the modal here, and let's wrap our login component with this modal, and let's import it from the components directory, and we're good to go. Let's go back to our home page, and now if I click on the sign in, you can see the login form is inside a modal component now. So if I click on the sign in, you can see it will authenticate the user and render the name of the user in the app bar. So now let's sign out and again click on the sign in, but if I refresh the page, it will actually take us to the actual sign-in page, not the intercepted sign-in page. So this is the beauty of intercepting route of the Next.js. So let's get back to our home page. Again, if I click on the link component here, you can see we intercept the sign-in route in the app directory. Okay, that's it for this tutorial, and in the upcoming section of this playlist, I will teach you how you can register a new user in your database with Prisma and also Drizzle ORM. Also, we are going to talk about how you can handle the backend JWTs and refreshing the backend JWTs. Have a nice time and stay tuned for my next video. Bye bye.